That man looked straight across the dinner table and told my grandson that our family was not the kind of family his granddaughter should be tied to. 8 people heard every single word. Not one of them spoke. Not one of them objected. There was only the faint clink of silverware against porcelain, and then the room sank into a silence so heavy it felt suffocating. Walter Brennan sat there with the confidence of a man who had never been denied anything in his life. He believed money determined a person's worth, believed power lived in contracts, skyscrapers bearing his name, and the way people lowered their eyes when he entered a room. He thought he held every card at the table. But there was one thing Walter Brennan never stopped to consider, not once during the 11 months he spent calling and demanding an answer, that the biggest project of his entire life was sitting on the desk of the very man he had just looked down on. My name is Russell Okafor. I'm 68 years old. And before I tell you the rest of this story, I want to tell you something about silence. Because most people misunderstand it. They think silence is what happens when a person has nothing left to say. It isn't. Sometimes silence is the most terrifying sound in the room. Sometimes it's the thing that happens right before everything collapses. I carried this story inside me for a very long time. There were nights I convinced myself to bury it and let time erase it. But eventually I realized that maybe someone out there needs to hear this. Staying quiet does not mean you are weak. And just because a man does not strike back immediately, does not mean he lacks the power to destroy everything. So this is that story. The morning it really began, I was sitting on my back steps in the hills east of Portland with my grandson Eli, and he was eating a pear. 6 years old. His hands were small around that pear like it was the most serious job in the world. The rain had let up for an hour, the way it does here in October, and the firs were dripping, and neither of us was saying much. My hands looked ancient next to his. Big knuckles, loose skin, 40 years of work written into them. I didn't mind the difference. I liked it, actually. It felt like the end of a long sentence finally finding its period. I've lived in the same gray cedar house on that slope for 23 years. It's small. It sits back behind a stand of Douglas firs, and on a clear winter day you can see Mount Hood from the kitchen if the clouds cooperate, which they mostly don't. The neighbors think of me as the quiet retired man who shows up with a wrench when somebody's pipe bursts and disappears before anybody can thank him properly. That suited me fine. I drove a 15-year-old truck and let people assume whatever was easiest. Folks rarely look past the surface unless you hand them a reason to. I never handed them one. My son Daniel lived 20 minutes north with his wife Priya and their boy Eli. We did Sunday dinners, the 4 of us, around their kitchen table. Those nights were good. Eli would talk about everything at once, the way kids do when they feel safe enough to fill up all the quiet. Daniel would catch my eye over the boy's head, and we'd trade a look that didn't need translating. That was enough, more than enough. Priya was warm, the kind of person who refilled your water before you knew it was empty. But I'd noticed something over the past few months, and I kept it to myself. Her phone would buzz at dinner, and she'd glance at it and turn it face down beside her plate. One night the screen stayed lit when she reached for it, and I caught the name before it went dark. It said Dad. She didn't mention it. Neither did I. I've learned that a thing you notice and a thing you're ready to act on are 2 different animals, and you do yourself no favors confusing them. Walter Brennan came by on a Sunday in October. Priya's father. A developer who wore his confidence the way some men wear a heavy watch visible and meant to be seen. He shook my hand, which is to say he took my fingers, gave them a half second, and let go. The handshake of a man who has already priced you and moved on. He asked if I was still doing my little consulting thing. He put a small weight on little. The kind of weight that reminds you of your place without quite being rude enough to call out. I looked at him for a moment. I told him yes, still consulting. I smiled. I left it there. Later that evening he said something to the whole table about how children need the right environment, the right sort of people around them as they grow. He didn't aim it at anyone, but the table wasn't big. If you've ever sat in a room where someone talked about the right kind of people while looking just past you, you already know the particular temperature that comes into your chest. It isn't anger, not at first. It's more like the air pressure dropping before a storm. You feel it in your ears before you understand it in your head. I drove home that night with the radio off. At the first bend past the tree line, I checked the mirror and watched the yellow glow of their kitchen window vanish behind the firs. I wasn't troubled. I was noting it. The way you note clouds stacking up in the west when you've lived long enough to read a sky. Daniel called on a Tuesday while I was pulling on my jacket. His voice was level 2 level, the way a man's voice gets when he's decided to sound fine before the call even connects. He said a second contract had fallen through. The client gave no reason in writing, just the usual line about moving in a different direction. I let him finish. Then I asked one question. Did anyone call that client before the decision came down? He said he figured it was just the market. I said maybe. I told him to have a good day. I let him go. I thought about it on the drive in, not with alarm, more the way you think about a noise inside the walls of an old house. Something small and out of place that you file away without acting on yet. 2 canceled contracts in 1 year, both without paper, both with the same empty non-answer. The market was one explanation. It wasn't the only one. My office sits in a low brick building on the south edge of the city, set back behind a row of birches that have outgrown their space. The sign over the door is plain. Inside, that morning, my people moved through their routines, coffee in hand, eyes down on the work. I said good morning, hung up my jacket, sat down. There were 16 emails. I read them in order, the way I always do. I don't skip ahead. 14 were routine. The 15th stopped me. Not on my face, just inside. The sender was Brennan Land Partners. The subject line read, Submission BLP, 3319 status request, follow-up. I opened it. I read it once. I closed the laptop, stood, and went to make a cup of coffee. I didn't tell anyone. There was nothing to tell yet. What I had was a single data point, and a data point isn't a conclusion. A man who acts on one piece of information before he has the whole picture is a man who can be steered. I have never had any interest in being steered. I'd waited a long time for a lot of things. I could wait a few more days. Now, I want to stop here and say something, because I think it matters. If this were a movie, this is the part where the music swells, and the old man starts plotting his revenge. But that isn't what happened, and that isn't who I am. I didn't want to destroy Walter Brennan. I want to be plain about that. What I wanted was for the truth to be in the room. That's all. The truth, standing where everyone could see it. What it did once it got there was its own business. Walter showed up at Daniel's place unannounced on a Thursday. I happened to be there. I watched him come through the front door like a man used to rooms rearranging themselves around him. He took a glass of water. He settled into the chair at the head of the table that nobody had offered him, and inside 10 minutes he'd steered the conversation to Eli's upbringing. He said he'd been thinking about what was best for the boy. Said children need a suitable environment, the right influences as they grow. He used suitable environment twice. Both times his eyes flicked toward Daniel before sliding away. Daniel smiled and said something easy and non-committal. Priya looked down at her hands in her lap. I sat in the corner with a glass of tea and said nothing. I watched Walter the way I've learned to watch men like him. He'd spent decades reading rooms and adjusting himself to fit them, and he was good at it. What he hadn't accounted for, what men like him almost never do, is the chance that someone else in the room is doing the exact same thing, and has been doing it longer. Honestly, if that had been my father-in-law talking about my child that way, I don't know that I'd have managed to keep my seat. I'd like to think I would, but I'm not certain. There's a younger version of me that would have stood up and said something I couldn't take back. I've made peace with the fact that the older version is better at this. It took me most of a lifetime to get here. I drove home after 9. The roads were dark and empty. Back at the house, I made fresh coffee, sat at my desk, and opened a thick technical file I'd been meaning to review 80-some pages of specifications and load assessments. I read at the pace the material asked for. After a while I set it down and looked out at the black yard. The tree line was barely there against the sky. The coffee went cold. Morning was a long way off, and I was in no hurry to reach it. The call I'd half been expecting came on a Friday, just after noon. I was standing in a grocery store parking lot with a paper bag in one hand, and my keys in the other when Daniel's name lit up the phone. I answered, and I knew before he got a word out that something had broken. There's a particular quality to silence on a phone line when the person on the other end is holding himself together by will alone. I'd heard that silence before, a long time ago. In a different life. He told me the firm had let him go. They called it internal restructuring. Clean words, nothing in writing, the kind of exit that leaves a man no trail to follow. But a colleague he trusted had told him, quietly, what really happened. 2 weeks earlier, someone had called a senior partner and raised questions about whether Daniel was the right fit for the firm's higher-end clients. The caller introduced himself as a longtime regional business associate. He never gave a company name. I stood beside my truck and listened to my son without interrupting once. When he finished, I asked him where he was. He said he was at the house. I told him I was on my way. I put the groceries in the bed of the truck and pulled out of the lot before the call had even fully ended. Priya had called Daniel an hour before I did. Walter had gone to her the night before, while Daniel was still at work, and laid it out plainly. If she stayed in the marriage, he'd pull back the assets held in her name and end every bit of financial support he'd extended over the years. He told her the Okafor family wasn't the right kind of people for her future. Those were his words. Not the right kind of people. I drove the 20 minutes north with no radio. I didn't need noise. Thinking has always come easier to me in quiet than anywhere else. I figured that out young, and never stopped being grateful for it. He was on the front steps when I turned onto his street. I could see him from half a block off, elbows on his knees, head down, 2 duffel bags on the ground beside his feet. His car was at the curb with the passenger door not quite shut, and from inside I could hear something small and tinny, a children's song, still playing through the speakers, a little voice singing something simple and untroubled, the way kids' music always sounds like the world outside it doesn't exist. Eli was asleep in the back. Head tipped against the seat, mouth barely open, one hand curled under his chin, still in his jacket from school, still in his shoes. He'd fallen asleep the way children do when the grown-ups around them have stopped making sense and the body just decides it's done being awake. I got out and walked over to where Daniel sat. I didn't say anything right away. I put my hand on his shoulder and left it there. He didn't look up. After a moment, I told him to get his bags. I told him we were going home. That was all I said. I opened the back door and reached in for Eli. He stirred and then settled, his arms finding my neck without his eyes ever opening, his small weight shifting against my chest the way it used to when he was barely walking, and I'd carry him in from the car after long Sunday afternoons. I stood there a second in the quiet of that street, holding my grandson while the little song played on behind me. Nobody was watching. The street was empty. The evening was coming in gray and cool off the river. I want to be clear about something, because it matters to everything that came after. That moment standing there with Eli's sleeping weight against me and Daniel finally picking up his bags behind me, that was not the beginning of a plan. It was the beginning of a certainty. Those are 2 very different things, and I need you to understand the difference, because the whole rest of this turns on it. Morning came in soft, the way it does after a hard night, like the world's giving you a minute to find your feet before it asks anything of you. I was up before 6, made coffee, set the table, dropped bread in the toaster, left the radio off. Eli came padding down the hall in his socks about 20 minutes later, climbed onto a chair, and sat swinging his legs while he waited for his toast. He asked if we still had the blackberry jam from last time. I told him we did. I made sure to say it warmly, right in front of him, because a child reads your tone long before he understands your words. Daniel came down a few minutes later. He'd made an effort, combed his hair, put on a clean shirt. I noticed. I didn't say anything about it, but I noticed, and I was grateful. He sat across from Eli, poured himself coffee, and asked the boy what he wanted to do that morning, in the easy, unhurried voice of a father trying to hand his son one ordinary day inside a day that was anything but. Eli said he wanted to check if the apples on the tree out back were ready. Daniel said that sounded like a fine plan. Nobody mentioned Walter. Nobody needed to. I left for the office before 8. The drive down out of the hills takes about 25 minutes on a clear morning, long enough to think without interruption, which is one reason I've never minded it. By the time I pulled into the lot, I'd already settled the order of what came first. My operations manager is a steady, precise woman named Frances who'd been with me 19 years. She was already at her desk. I said good morning, hung up my jacket, and asked her to pull the complete file on Brennan Land Partners. Every pending submission, every piece of outstanding correspondence, everything in the system. She asked if there was a particular concern. I told her I just wanted to review it thoroughly. She had it on my conference table inside 15 minutes. I shut the door and sat down with it alone. The project was the largest single development Brennan Land Partners had ever attempted, a mixed commercial and residential complex on the east bank of the river. Years in the planning. The kind of thing that becomes a company's legacy if it goes right. and its cautionary tale if it doesn't. The file ran past 100 pages. I read it front to back and let the picture build itself instead of hunting for any one piece. The picture was this. The project had cleared every regulatory hurdle. It was ready to break ground inside the quarter. And one single requirement stood between Walter Brennan and the biggest moment of his professional life, a certified structural and infrastructure review signed off by a qualified engineering firm. Without it, the project could not legally proceed. The state kept a short list of firms in the region carrying the certification for a build that size. There were 2 names on that list. Okafor Structural was one of them. Walter Brennan had submitted his application to my firm 11 months earlier. His project coordinator had been chasing its status ever since. So, Walter had been waiting on my signature for 11 months. He'd sat at my son's dinner table and decided my family was beneath his. He'd made phone calls that cost my son his livelihood. He'd delivered an ultimatum to his own daughter about the sort of people she was allowed to build a life with. And through every bit of it, from the first application to the last unanswered follow-up, he had never once known whose door he'd been knocking on. I sat a while after I finished. I looked through the glass wall of my office at the floor below, where my engineers were at their stations doing what they'd always done, capable and unhurried, with no idea that the file on my table had just redrawn the whole map. I'll tell you what I felt, because I think you're owed the truth. It wasn't triumph. I keep meeting people who expect it to have been triumph, and it wasn't. What I felt was tired, and a little sad, and underneath that, very calm, because I understood in that moment that I would not have to do anything cruel. The truth was already heavy enough. I just had to stop holding it up off the floor for him. I picked up my coffee. It had gone lukewarm. I set it down. I opened the door and told Francis to leave the file exactly where it was. We'd process it through the proper procedure, the same as everything else. Some men spend a whole life building what they like to call an empire, and never once ask who holds the key to the front door. The letter went out that afternoon on company letterhead, in the standard language we use for any submission entering an extended review. It told Brennan Land Partners that application BLP 3319 had been placed into comprehensive technical review, and that the process would take an additional 45 days. The language was precise. It cited the relevant regulatory clause. It carried no urgency, no hostility, no opinion of any kind. In every visible way, it was routine. What it was in every other way did not need to be written down. Francis sent it at 4:11. I was already in my truck. I drove home, made dinner, and helped Eli with a jigsaw puzzle he'd been chipping at since morning. When I went to bed that night, I slept without trouble, which I've always taken as a reliable sign that I've done the right thing. I'd asked Daniel to come by the office the next morning. I told him to dress for a professional setting and be there by 9. He asked why. I told him there was something I wanted him to see, and the rest would make more sense in person. He was quiet a moment, then said he'd be there. He came in at 9:02. I was on the production floor, near the far end of the main corridor, and I watched him through the interior glass before he saw me. He stepped into the lobby and stopped. He looked up first, the way people do when they walk into a space bigger than they expected, tilting his head back to take in the ceiling, 40 feet up, strung with cable runs and rolled technical drawings hanging at intervals. Below them, the floor moved with the rhythm of a place that's been running well for a long time. Engineers at their stations, equipment cycling through its work, people moving with a kind of focus you can't fake and can't perform. Daniel's mouth came open a little. He stood there in the middle of all of it. A man from the structural division happened to be crossing the lobby and put out his hand and introduced himself, told Daniel he looked just like his father. Daniel shook the hand and said thank you, and from across the floor I could see he didn't yet have words for what he was standing inside of. I walked over and brought him up to my office, poured 2 coffees, set 3 folders on the desk between us without a word of preamble. The first held the company financials. The second, the organizational chart. The third had the Brennan Land Partners name on the tab. Daniel picked it up, read the first page, set it down slowly. He said that was Priya's father's project. I told him it was. He said Walter had never known this company was mine. I told him no, he hadn't. A silence that lasted long enough to mean something. Then Daniel asked how long. I told him 36 years. He looked around the office, taking it in without speaking, and his eyes settled on the framed photo at the corner of my desk, him at 10 years old, standing on a job site in a hard hat 3 sizes too big, grinning at the camera with the easy confidence of a boy who has no idea yet how much the world is going to ask of him. I'd put that picture on my desk the same year I took it. It hadn't moved since. He looked at it a long while. I didn't say anything about it. Some things explain themselves better in quiet than they ever could out loud. I slid a sealed envelope across the desk and told him to open it. Inside was a formal offer, Director of Project Relations at Okafor Structural, with a compensation package attached. He read it once, then again. He said he'd never done anything like this before. I told him that a man who shows up completely, every time, without being asked twice, already knows 70% of what the job requires. The rest I'd teach him. He picked up the pen from the edge of the desk and signed his name at the bottom, in the steady, unhurried way of someone who's already made up his mind. I signed the company copy after him and set it aside. Outside the window, the floor hummed along at its usual pace. 36 years of early mornings and quiet decisions, made visible in the movement of people who had no idea what had just shifted in the room above them. I made no phone calls the morning after the notice went out. The letter had entered the system through the proper channels, been logged, been delivered, the way all our correspondence is, without drama, without apology. What happened next was not something I set in motion. It was something that had simply been waiting to happen, once the right information reached the right place at the right time. Walter's investment partners started calling him before 9. I know this not because I was watching, but because these things have a logic to them that anyone who's spent enough years in this business understands. A 45-day extension on a project at the final stage doesn't stay quiet. It moves through the money attached to that project the way a crack moves through old concrete, steadily, without asking permission. By midday, Walter's standing on his own development had become something he'd have to explain to people who did not enjoy needing explanations. He called Okafor Structural at 2. Our receptionist answered, asked how she could direct the call, and put him through to the right extension. The voice that picked up was calm and even. It said, "Okafor Structural, Daniel Okafor speaking." There was a silence on the line that ran 2 full seconds. Then Walter said he was sorry, and asked if the other man could repeat his name. I wasn't on that call. Daniel told me about it after, briefly, without embroidering it. Said Walter went quiet and then ended the call politely, citing a scheduling conflict. There was nothing more to tell. The silence had already said everything. Walter went back to his office and did what anyone does when a name lands wrong in their chest. He searched it, pulled up the company registration, read the founding year, read the listed principals, found the name he was looking for on the second line. Russell A. Okafor, founder, established 36 years prior. He set his phone face down on his desk. He stood and walked to his window and looked out at the city he'd spent his whole career trying to own pieces of. I wasn't there to see it, but I've known enough men like Walter Brennan to know exactly what that moment looked like. A man standing alone with the full weight of his own assumptions finally come to rest across his shoulders, and no one else in the room to help him hold it. And here's where I have to tell you the part most people don't expect, because it's the part that taught me the most. Priya came to my house that afternoon. She didn't call first. She knocked, came in when I opened the door, and sat down at the kitchen table without taking off her coat. She asked me whether I thought her father was going to be all right. It was an honest question, and it deserved an honest answer. I told her I didn't know. I put the kettle on. She talked a while, and I listened without interrupting. And she told me something about her father she said she'd never put into words for anyone. Decades back, before she was old enough to understand it, Walter had lost nearly everything in a collapse he hadn't seen coming and couldn't stop. The man who came out the other side of that wasn't quite the same as the one who'd gone in. The need to control every outcome, to manage every appearance, to make sure nobody around him held a position he hadn't personally approved. That need hadn't come from strength. It had come from a fear so old he'd stopped recognizing it as fear at all. I listened to all of it. And I want to be careful here, because this is the part that's easy to get wrong. Understanding why a person becomes capable of doing a harmful thing is not the same as excusing the harm. The calls Walter made, the pressure he put on his own daughter, the words he used about my family, those things happened. They did real damage to real people I love. A history of pain behind a decision does not undo the decision. Priya wasn't asking me to pretend otherwise, and I didn't. But I'll tell you what knowing his story did do. It took the last of the anger out of me, because once you see the frightened man underneath the proud one, it gets very hard to hate him. You can hold him accountable. You should. But hatred needs a cartoon to feed on, and Walter Brennan had stopped being a cartoon the moment his daughter sat at my table and told me the truth. I slid her tea across the table when she was done, and I sat with her in the quiet a while, because that was what the moment asked for. If you've ever had to forgive someone without telling them they were forgiven, without even deciding to, just feeling the weight set itself down on its own, then you know there's no word for that feeling. It isn't peace exactly. It's more like putting down a bag you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten it was heavy. That evening I stood in the hallway outside the little room where Daniel was reading to Eli. The lamp threw a warm circle of light over the two of them. Eli tucked under the blanket with his eyes going heavy, Daniel's voice low and even, turning pages without rushing. I watched from the doorway a moment. Then I stepped back and pulled the door nearly shut, leaving just enough of a gap for the light to reach the floor. Some things don't need you in the room to be complete. They only need you to have made them possible. Walter Brennan came to the office on a Thursday morning at 9. I watched him cross the lot from the second-floor window, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man who has rehearsed his composure in the car. Daniel was already in the lobby when he came through the door, standing near the center of the room, jacket on, hands easy at his sides, not bracing for anything, not performing anything. Just present, the way a person is present when he belongs somewhere and doesn't need to prove it. I stayed where I was, up in the hallway. I hadn't planned to go in. I didn't go in. They moved to the small conference room off the main corridor. I could see the doorway but not the table, and I didn't need to see the table. I'd already done the thing I came into that building to do. What happened in that room belonged to my son. Walter sat down across from him and was quiet a moment before he spoke. He looked at the photograph on the desk, the one of Daniel at 10 in the oversized hard hat, grinning at whoever stood behind the camera. He held his eyes on it for several seconds. Then he said he had been wrong about Daniel's family. The sentence was short. It didn't have the shape of something rehearsed. Daniel didn't rush to forgive him. He also didn't push him away with silence. He said, "Thank you for saying that." And he meant it, and he left it right there. Then Daniel slid a contract across the table and told Walter he'd written it to be fair. Nothing more, nothing less. The terms were reasonable and plain. Nothing built to wound. Walter read it through without a word. Then he picked up the pen and signed his name at the bottom. Daniel signed after him, slowly, with the unhurried certainty of a man who'd already decided. The only sound in the room was the pen moving across the paper. And then that sound stopped, and it was over. After Walter left, Daniel went down and out through the side door into the small courtyard behind the building. There's an old wooden chair out there I've been drinking my morning coffee in for 15 years, set against the back wall where the sun reaches first. Daniel sat down in it. He looked around the quiet yard, the uneven pavers, the old maple in the far corner, the plain sky above the roofline, and then, for the first time in longer than I could count in days, he let out a long breath. Not a sigh with anything performed in it, just air going out of a man who'd been holding something heavy and had finally been allowed to set it down. I watched from the window above. I didn't go down. There are moments that belong entirely to the person inside them, and that was one. Me being there wouldn't have added anything. Me having made it possible was the whole point. This story taught me something I've been turning over ever since, and I'll hand it to you plainly because I think it's worth more than the story itself. The mistake most people make in a moment like the one Walter handed me is believing they have to win it right then, out loud, in front of everyone. That the only way to answer a man who looks through you is to make him look at you. But what I understood that night at the dinner table, sitting in the corner with my glass of tea, was that I didn't have to make Walter see me at all. The truth was going to arrive on its own schedule, whether he was ready or not. My only job was to keep my hands clean enough that when it got there, I could live with the part I'd played. So here's the one thing I'd ask you to actually do, today, if any of this landed. The next time someone diminishes you, and everything in you wants to set the record straight in the moment, just wait. Not forever. Not as a strategy to crush them later. Just long enough to ask yourself whether the truth is already on its way, and whether your job might simply be to stop carrying it up off the floor for them. And then sit with this question, the one I still sit with. Who in your life are you quietly underestimating, the way Walter underestimated me? Now I'd like to hear from you, because I always do, and I read more of these than you'd think. If you believe I did the right thing staying quiet, letting the procedure run, never once raising my voice. Comment a 1. If you think I should have said something out loud at that dinner table, the night he talked about the right kind of people, comment a 2. And if you think I should have processed that application faster and just been done with the whole thing, comment a 3. There's no wrong answer. I'm honestly curious where you land. And tell me where you're watching from, and what time it is there as you listen to this. I like picturing the places these stories travel to. And if you've ever sat in a room and stayed quiet while someone looked right through you, not because you were scared of what you'd say, but because you already understood something they hadn't gotten to yet, tell me about it below. I think more of us have lived in that kind of silence than we ever let on. If this stayed with you, consider subscribing, so stories like this one can keep finding the people who need them. It means more than you know that you sat with this all the way to the end. This is a fictional story inspired by real emotional experiences, fully rewritten and reimagined in Portland, Oregon to create original content. Any resemblance to real people or events is coincidental.